In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And on the wrong end of it, there is a man at a desk, cross-referencing grain allotments, whose hands start shaking at 6 in the morning for reasons he cannot explain. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story has no soldiers, no heroes, no last stands. This is the story of Torven Gale, census scribe, a man whose entire life was numbers, columns, ledgers, decimal points, population registers. A nobody by his own admission. And that's exactly why this story matters. Because when the World Eaters came to Vithara Secundus, they didn't come for the soldiers. They came for everyone. This is what an invasion looks like from the ground floor, from inside a dome city with manufactured air and manufactured rain, through the eyes of a man whose only weapon is clarity, the ability to look at what's in front of him and describe it exactly as it is. No embellishment, no comfort, just the numbers. This one does not have a happy ending. It barely has an ending at all. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. They say that when the World Eaters come, you hear them before you see them. That is a lie. You feel them. You feel them in the marrow of your bones, in the wet meat of your heart, in the back of your teeth where the roots dig into your jaw. I know this because I was there. I was sitting at my cogitator station on the 42nd floor of the Numistral spire, cross-referencing grain allotments for the southern habitation clusters, and my hands began to shake. Not from fear, not yet. From something that had no name, no shape, no origin. A vibration that lived inside my chest like a second heartbeat, thick and wrong, beating to a rhythm that did not belong to me. My name is Torven Gale, and I am a census scribe of the 3rd Administrative Bureau on Vithara Secundus. Or I was. I suppose it does not matter what I was. What matters is what happened to Vithara Secundus on the day the sky broke open, and what happened to me, and what I saw with my own eyes before those eyes stopped seeing anything at all. I want to tell you this clearly, because clarity is the only weapon I ever had. I was trained in it. 15 years behind a cogitator, 15 years of tallying and sorting and filing. And the one skill it gave me was the ability to look at something and describe it precisely. Numbers do not lie, they do not embellish. They sit in their columns and they tell you exactly what is there, no more, no less. And I intend to do the same. What I am about to tell you is the truth, not the truth of generals or commissars or priests who wrap everything in the Emperor's light until the shape of it disappears. The truth of a man who was very small, in a very large place, on the worst day that place had ever known. Vithara Secundus was a dome world, not a hive, not a forge, not a shrine. A dome world. If you have never lived under a dome, let me explain what that means. It means you grow up knowing that the sky is a lie. The real sky, the one above the dome, is a thing of yellow-brown poison, thick with sulfur compounds and industrial residue from the mining operations on the planet's northern hemisphere. Vithara Secundus was colonized 8,000 years ago as a mineral extraction site, and whatever atmosphere it once had was burned away in the 1st century of operations. What remained was unbreathable, corrosive, the kind of air that would eat the lining of your lungs in 6 minutes flat and leave you drowning in your own dissolved tissue on the ground. So they built the domes, 17 of them spread across the equatorial belt, each one a sealed city under a canopy of reinforced armor, glass, and plasteel lattice. Inside, the air was manufactured, the light was manufactured, the rain, when it came, was manufactured, Everything was a product of the Mechanicus atmospheric processors that hummed day and night in the sub-levels, and everything was meticulously controlled, and everything was catalogued, and everything was filed in the archives of the Numistral Spire. That was my world, the world of files and ledgers and population registers. I want you to understand this about me, because it will matter later, because when everything began to fall apart, the way I understood the falling was through the framework of my profession. I was not a soldier. I was not a preacher. I was not even a particularly devout man, if I am being honest, though I said my prayers at the appointed hours and attended the feast of the Emperor's Ascension every year without fail. I was a bureaucrat, a functionary, a man whose greatest daily crisis was a discrepancy in the water purification reports or a mismatched census entry from Habitation Block 19. I wore the same gray tunic every day, ate the same synthetic gruel every morning, rode the same rattling cargo lifter to the 42nd floor every dawn cycle, and sat at the same cogitator terminal until the chime told me my shift was done. I was, by any meaningful measure, nobody. And I think that is precisely why I need to tell this story, because what happened to Vithara Secundus happened mostly to nobodies, to people like me, to the faceless billions who exist in the cracks of the Imperium's vast machinery, who are born and labor and die without ever being seen by anyone who matters. The Imperium does not write our stories. The Imperium does not even know our names. We are numbers in a column, and when we are gone, the column is simply updated. A line is drawn. A new figure is entered. The machine keeps turning. There is one more thing you should know about me before I go any further. I had a sister, Aderin. She was 4 years younger than me, and she worked in the lower levels of Dome 9, in the textile mills that produce the standard-issue tunics and bedding for the habitation blocks. She was not like me, where I was quiet and careful and obsessed with the neatness of columns. Aderin was loud and careless and full of a kind of furious energy that I never understood, a need to push against the edges of things, to ask questions that nobody wanted asked. She used to say that the domes were not cities. They were cages, and the people inside them were not citizens. They were inventory. I told her to be quiet. I told her that kind of talk would get her noticed by the wrong people. I told her to keep her head down and do her work, and be grateful for the air she was breathing, because that air was a gift from the Mechanicus and the Emperor and the vast machinery of governance that kept us all alive, and gratitude was the least we owed in return. She laughed at me when I said that. She always laughed at me. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of someone who loved you enough to find your blindness funny, rather than infuriating. 7 years ago, Aderin did not come home from her shift. I filed a missing persons report with the enforcers. Reference number 7741-Sigma-Dome 9. I followed up every week for 6 months. The response was always the same. Investigation ongoing. No leads, no evidence of foul play. After 6 months, the case was reclassified as a voluntary disappearance. After a year, the file was closed. Her name was removed from the census rolls. Her habitation unit was reassigned. Her ration allocation was cancelled. And I, Torven Gael, census scribe, the man who could find a misplaced decimal point from 3 floors away, could not find his own sister. I looked. I looked in the records, in the data streams, in the population registers that I spent my days tending. I pulled her file and traced every entry, every timestamp, every cross-reference, and I found nothing. Not because the records were incomplete, but because they were perfect. Too perfect. Her absence had been woven into the data so seamlessly that the numbers balanced without her, as if she had never existed at all, as if the system had simply closed around the space where she had been and filled it in with new figures that left no gap, no seam, no trace. I stopped looking. I filed the grief the way I filed everything else, in its proper place, in its proper category, with its proper reference number, and I went back to work. But the question never left me. Not where did she go? I could accept not knowing that. The question that stayed, the one that lived in the back of my skull like a splinter, was this: how can a person disappear so completely from a system that records everything? I am getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the morning. Let me go back to the shaking. It started at the 6th hour of the dawn cycle. I know the exact time because I had just logged into my terminal, and the chrono stamp on my first entry read 6 hours, 0 minutes, 14 seconds, Terran Standard. I remember pulling up the grain allotment files for the southern clusters because there had been a discrepancy flagged the previous evening. Dome 17, the smallest of the equatorial domes and the one furthest from the primary spaceport, had reported a 12% surplus in its grain stores, which made no sense because Dome 17 had also reported a 6% population increase in the same quarter. More mouths, more grain consumed, less surplus. The numbers contradicted themselves, and contradictory numbers were my speciality. I was known for it in the Bureau. Torven Gael, the man who found the error. Torven Gael, the man who could smell a misplaced decimal point from 3 floors away. It was not glamorous work. It was not important work. Not in the grand scheme of things. But it was mine, and I was good at it. And there was a quiet satisfaction in making the numbers align. I had just opened the secondary file when my hands stopped obeying me. The tremor came first in my right hand, a fine vibration that made the stylus jump against the input pad. I thought it was the building. The Numistral spire was old, one of the original administrative structures from the founding era, and it had a tendency to sway in the upper floors when the atmospheric processors cycled through their high-pressure phase. But this was different. The tremor was not in the building. It was in me. It radiated from somewhere behind my sternum, a dull, rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with something I could not hear. Like standing too close to a generatorum, feeling the bass vibration of its turning without actually hearing the sound. Except there was no generatorum near the 42nd floor. There was nothing on the 42nd floor except cogitator banks and filing cabinets, and 300 scribes in identical gray tunics, all of them hunched over their terminals, all of them doing exactly what I was doing. I looked around. To my left, Garavic was typing. Garavic was always typing. He was a large man with thick fingers and a permanent squint, and he attacked his cogitator like it had personally offended him, each keystroke a tiny act of violence. To my right, Malaya Dosht was sipping from her recaf mug, eyes half closed, performing the morning ritual she performed every morning, which was to drink exactly 3 sips of recaf before touching her terminal. She claimed it helped her focus. I claimed it was superstition. We had this argument every week. Behind me, old Prothus was already asleep, chin on chest, mouth open, a thin thread of drool connecting his lower lip to his tunic. Prothus had been on the 42nd floor for 37 years. He had earned his naps. None of them were shaking. None of them seemed to feel what I was feeling. I flexed my fingers, pressed my palms flat against the desk, and tried to will the vibration away. It did not go away. If anything, it grew stronger. It was a heartbeat, not mine. Something else's, something vast and far away, and utterly indifferent to the fact that a census scribe on the 42nd floor of an administrative building on a minor dome world in the galactic east was sitting at his desk trying very hard not to scream. I did not scream. I am not a man who screams. I am a man who files reports, and what I did instead was log a maintenance request for my cogitator terminal, citing irregular vibration in the input mechanisms. It was the most Torven Gael response possible. The world could be ending, and my first instinct would be to fill out the appropriate form. I submitted the request, received an automated confirmation, and returned to the grain discrepancy. The vibration continued, but I had acknowledged it, categorized it, and assigned it a reference number, and somehow that made it manageable. This is what bureaucracy does to a man. It teaches you that everything, no matter how strange or terrible, can be reduced to a form, a file, a number. It teaches you that naming a thing gives you power over it. This is, I now understand, a magnificent and fatal delusion. But it got me through the morning. The next 3 hours were ordinary. I traced the grain discrepancy to a data entry error in Dome 17's sub-level commissariat. Someone had transposed 2 digits in the population count, entering 7,412 instead of 4,712. A simple mistake. The kind of mistake that happened every day, across every dome in every bureau. I corrected it, flagged it for review, and moved on to the water purification reports. The vibration in my chest faded to a background hum, something I could almost ignore if I concentrated on the numbers. Garavic typed. Malaya sipped. Prothus snored. The atmospheric processors hummed in the sublevels. The artificial sun crept across the interior of the dome, casting its perfectly calibrated light through the armor glass windows of the Numistral spire. Everything was normal. Everything was in order. At the 9th hour, the Voxcaster on the wall crackled. This was not unusual in itself. The Voxcasters crackled all the time. They were old, like everything in the spire, and they were poorly maintained because the maintenance budget for administrative infrastructure had been cut by 14% in the last fiscal cycle, a fact I knew because I had processed the requisition forms myself. But the crackle that came at the 9th hour was different. It was longer, louder, and underneath it, barely audible, there was a sound that I could not immediately identify. A low, grinding moan, like metal being twisted by enormous hands. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds, and then the Voxcaster went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The hiss of background static that normally filled the pauses between announcements was gone. The speaker was dead. I looked at Garavic. Garavic was still typing. Malaya had put down her recaf and was staring at the Voxcaster with a slight frown, the expression she wore when something did not fit the expected pattern. Behind me, Prothus was still asleep. 300 scribes on the 42nd floor, and most of them had not even looked up. A crackle on the Vox was nothing. A dead speaker was nothing. It would be logged, reported, and repaired in its turn. The machine kept turning, except the vibration in my chest was getting stronger again. It had not stopped, I realized. I had just gotten better at ignoring it. But now it was back, louder, closer, and this time I could feel it in my jaw, in my back teeth, a resonance that made my fillings ache. I pressed my tongue against the roof of my mouth and tasted copper. Not recaf, not the metallic tang of recycled air. Copper. Clean and bright and unmistakable. The taste of a bitten cheek, of blood on the tongue. But I had not bitten anything. My mouth was intact. The taste had no source. I was going to file another maintenance request. That was the thought in my head, clear as a bell. I was going to open the form, describe the symptom, submit it for review. I was going to reduce this creeping wrongness to a reference number and move on with my day. I had the form half open on my screen when a new sound came through the dead Voxcaster. Not the official channel, something else, bleeding through on an adjacent frequency, raw and unfiltered, a transmission that was not meant for us. A voice distorted by static and distance, but human, unmistakably human, speaking in the clipped cadence of a military operator. Dome 14, the voice said. Dome 14 is breached. Repeat, Dome 14 is breached. Multiple hostiles, unknown origin. No markings consistent with any recorded Xenos threat. Requesting immediate reinforcement from Garrison Command. Dome 14 is, and the voice stopped. Not faded, stopped, replaced by a sound that was not static, and was not silence, and was not anything that belonged on a Vox frequency, a low, wet, grinding noise that went on for 3 seconds and then cut to nothing. The speaker was dead again. Dome 14 was 600 kilometers east of us, across the Poison Flats, one of the larger industrial domes in the equatorial belt. I had processed their census returns last quarter. Population 312,000. The number sat in my head, clean and precise, as the dead Vox caster hissed its empty hiss, and I thought, that was not our dome. That was somewhere else. Whatever was happening, it was not just happening here. I had the form half open on my screen when the windows blew in. Not all of them. Not yet. Just the ones on the eastern face of the spire, the ones that looked out over the main boulevard and the transit hub and the great circular plaza that the locals called the Emperor's Palm, because from above it looked like an open hand, 5 avenues radiating outward from a central fountain. I heard the glass before I understood what it was. A sound like 1,000 bells ringing at once, sharp and crystalline, followed immediately by a rush of air, hot and pressurized, that knocked the stacks of physical files off the shelves behind me and sent papers spiraling across the floor in a white blizzard. Garavic stopped typing. Malaya dropped her recaf mug. Prothus woke up. For a moment, perhaps 2 seconds, nobody moved. We all just sat there, 300 gray tunics in a room that was suddenly full of wind and noise and paper, staring at the eastern wall where the windows had been, and then someone stood up. I do not know who. Someone in the middle rows, a silhouette framed against the ragged gap where the armor glass had been, and they looked out and they made a sound. Not a word, not a scream. A sound like something being pulled out of them against their will, a low, involuntary moan that started in their stomach and came out of their mouth before they could stop it. And I understood in that moment that the sound I was hearing was not the breaking glass. It was not the wind. It was the thing that had been living in my chest all morning, the rhythm that had no source, the heartbeat that was not mine. And now it was outside. Now it was everywhere, and now it had a voice. I stood up. I walked to the broken windows. I looked down. If I had been a poet, I would have had words for what I saw. If I had been a soldier, I would have had a framework, a training protocol, a set of conditioned responses that would have told me what to do. But I was a census scribe, and the only framework I had was numbers. And the numbers that came to me as I looked down at the Emperor's Palm were these. 6. 6 objects in the sky, falling, not falling, descending, controlled, deliberate, trailing streamers of kim and black smoke against the artificial blue of the dome's manufactured sky. They were dark, those objects, dark and angular and wrong, covered in spikes and ridges that caught the light in ways that made my eyes water, as if the geometry of them did not quite agree with the geometry of everything else. They came down fast, faster than anything that size should have been able to move without tearing itself apart, and the sound they made was the sound I had been hearing in my chest all morning. Not a sound at all. A pressure, a presence. A thing that pushed against the inside of your skull and told you, in a language older than words, that something was coming that you were not built to survive. The first one hit the plaza. It did not crash. It did not land. It arrived. One moment it was in the air, a black shape screaming downward through the artificial sky, and the next moment it was on the ground, crouched in a crater of shattered paving stones, like a predator settling into its haunches. The impact ripple ran outward in a circle, cracking the flagstones, toppling the fountain, throwing the mourning crowds off their feet. I watched from 42 floors up as people fell, hundreds of them. Workers on their way to their shifts, vendors opening their stalls, children being led to the skolam by their mothers. They went down like grain before a thresher, knocked flat by a shock wave that I could feel even up here, even behind what remained of the eastern windows. The second Dreadclaw hit 3 seconds later, 200 meters north of the first, in the middle of the transit hub. The third took out the upper level of the commercial arcade on the western side of the avenue. The fourth and fifth came down together, so close that their craters overlapped, right in the mouth of the avenue that the locals called the Vein, the main artery that connected the Emperor's Palm to the industrial district. The sixth hit the base of the Numistral spire. I felt that one. The entire building lurched, a sick sideways motion that sent cogitator terminals sliding across the floor and people stumbling into walls. The lights flickered. Somewhere below us, deep in the guts of the building, something structural groaned and gave way with a sound like a bone breaking. Dust fell from the ceiling in a fine gray rain, and then the screaming started, not from our floor, from below, from outside, from everywhere at once, a rising chorus of human voices doing the one thing that human voices do when the world stops making sense. 300 scribes on the 42nd floor, and for a long, terrible moment, all we could do was listen. I want to be very precise about what happened next, because precision is all I have left. The Dreadclaws did not open immediately. They sat in their craters, steaming, ticking, making small sounds of cooling metal and shifting weight. And for perhaps 30 seconds there was nothing but the screams of the injured and the distant wail of emergency sirens beginning to spin up across the dome. 30 seconds. I know because I was watching the chrono on my terminal, the one that had survived the window detonation, its green numbers still ticking away as if time still mattered, as if anything that those numbers measured still had meaning. 30 seconds of silence from the Dreadclaws. 30 seconds of people in the plaza picking themselves up, dusting off their clothes, helping the fallen, doing all the human things that human beings do when something terrible has happened but might still be okay. Then the claws opened, not like doors, not like hatches, like mouths. The armored petals of the Dreadclaws peeled back with a shriek of metal on metal, each one extending outward and driving itself into the ground like a massive talon, lifting the body of the pod upward on 4 mechanical legs until it stood above the ruin it had made, a squatting insectile thing disgorging its contents onto the broken stones of the Emperor's palm. And out they came. I had seen pictures of space marines. Every citizen of the Imperium has seen pictures of space marines. They are on the recruitment posters that hang in every habitation block, on the covers of the propaganda pamphlets that are distributed at every feast day, in the stained glass windows of every chapel and cathedral from one end of the galaxy to the other. Angels of the Emperor, defenders of humanity, giants in shining armor, noble and pure and terrible in their righteous fury. I had seen those pictures 1,000 times. I had walked past them every day of my life without really looking at them, the way you stop seeing a wall after you have lived with it long enough. I thought I knew what a space marine looked like. I did not know. I did not know anything. What came out of those Dreadclaws was not what the pictures showed. What came out was something that had started as what the pictures showed and had then been taken apart and put back together by hands that hated the original design. They were huge, yes, enormous. Even from 42 floors up, they were unmistakably massive, their proportions wrong in the way that only something transhuman can be wrong, too broad, too thick, too dense, as if they had been carved from a material heavier than flesh and bone. Their armor was red, Not the clean, bright red of the propaganda posters, a red that had depth and texture to it, the red of old blood dried in layers, of rust forming on iron, of meat left too long in the sun. It was a red that looked like it had been earned, not painted, and even from this distance I could see that the surfaces of their war plate were covered in things: trophies, chains, bones, shapes that might have been skulls, hundreds of them, strung on cords and wires and bolted directly to the ceramite. They carried weapons, not the elegant gleaming bolters of the recruitment posters. Heavy, brutal things, axes and swords with toothed edges that caught the artificial light and threw it back in broken fragments. Some of them carried weapons in both hands. Some carried weapons that were part of their hands, grafted into the armor at the wrist. Blades and barrels and mechanisms of murder that had become as much a part of them as their fingers. They moved fast, far too fast for their size, with a lurching, headlong gait that had no grace in it, no discipline, no formation. They simply ran. They poured out of the Dreadclaws, and they ran, straight into the crowd, straight into the plaza full of workers and vendors and children, and they did not slow down. The sound reached me a heartbeat later. The sound of chain blades activating, a rising mechanical snarl that cut through the screaming like a hot wire through fat. And then a new sound underneath the snarl, wetter and thicker and infinitely worse. The sound of those blades finding flesh. The sound of bodies being opened. Not cut, not sliced. Opened. Torn apart at the seams like old cloth, the chain teeth grabbing and pulling and shredding in a way that no clean blade ever could. I stood at the broken window of the 42nd floor, and I watched the Emperor's palm turn red, and the vibration in my chest became a roar, a wave of pressure that was almost sound but not quite, a frequency that my bones could hear but my ears could not, and I understood at last what it was. It was joy. Not mine, theirs. The joy of the things in the red armor as they killed, an emanation so intense that it radiated from them like heat from a furnace, a subsonic bleed-through that soaked into everything around them, into the stones and the air and the walls, and the bones of a census scribe standing 42 floors above the slaughter with his mouth open and his stylus still in his hand, and absolutely no idea what to do. That is how it began on Vithara Secundus. Not with a warning, not with a declaration of war, not with the formal protocols of invasion that I had read about in the approved histories, the orbital bombardments and the Voxcast ultimatums and the orderly deployment of ground forces. It began with 6 Dreadclaws and a plaza full of the dead, and it began so fast that the siren was still winding up to its full pitch when the last body in the Emperor's palm stopped moving. 6 pods, perhaps 60 warriors, and in the time it had taken me to walk from my desk to the window, they had killed everyone in the plaza. Every single person, hundreds of them, gone, reduced to shapes on the ground that did not look like people anymore, that looked like something a butcher would throw away, too ruined to be useful, too broken to be recognizable as anything that had ever been alive. I stood at that window for too long. I know that now. I should have run immediately the moment the first Dreadclaw hit the ground. I should have turned from the window and made for the stairwell and gone down, or up, or anywhere that was not here, standing in full view of the killing ground with glass in my hair and the taste of copper on my tongue. But I did not run. I could not run, because the thing in my chest, the vibration, the heartbeat that was not mine, had me. It was holding me there, pressing against the inside of my ribs like a fist, and it was whispering something to me in a language I did not speak, and the whisper said, "Look. Look at what is happening. Look at what is real." And so I looked, because I was a man who had spent his entire life looking at things and recording them, and old habits do not die just because the world is ending. They are, in fact, the last things to go. What I saw from that window in the minutes that followed the opening of the Dreadclaws will stay with me for as long as I have left, which I suspect is not very long at all. But I want to get it right. I want to describe it the way it actually was, not the way a sane mind would want it to be. Because the truth of it is worse than anything I could invent, and the truth deserves at least one honest witness. The warriors in red armor did not fight the way I expected warriors to fight. I had grown up with stories of the Emperor's space marines, told in whispers by my father in our cramped habitation unit, tales of disciplined legions holding the line against Xenos horrors, of tactical genius and coordinated firepower, and the cold precision of transhuman killing machines. These were not those stories. There was nothing disciplined about what was happening in the Emperor's palm. There was nothing tactical, nothing cold, nothing precise. What I saw was frenzy, pure, unfiltered, animal frenzy. The warriors in red did not advance in formation. They did not establish firing positions. They did not communicate with each other in any way that I could see. They simply killed. Each one of them, alone in their own sphere of violence, spinning and hacking and tearing through the crowds with a speed and savagery that made them seem less like soldiers and more like natural disasters. Each one a localized catastrophe, a storm of blades and fists and ceramite-shod boots that left a trail of ruin wherever it passed. And they were screaming. Not words, not battle cries, not the war chants that the propaganda vids liked to show, those deep, resonant declarations of faith and fury that were supposed to strike terror into the enemies of mankind. What came out of those helmets was something else entirely. A raw, constant, formless howl, like the sound an animal makes when it has been caught in a trap and is tearing itself apart to get free. It was the sound of pain. I did not understand this at first. I did not understand why warriors who were winning, who were killing without opposition, who were carving through an unarmed civilian population like a hot blade through tallow, would be screaming in pain. I understand it now. The butcher's nails, that is what they are called, or so I learned later from the garbled fragments of Vox traffic that leaked through the building's internal systems in the hours that followed. The butcher's nails, the cortical implants that the 12th Legion drove into their own skulls, the things that rewired their brains so that pain was their only constant companion, and the only relief from that pain was the act of killing. The screaming was not rage, it was gratitude. They were thanking their nails for letting them feel something other than agony, even if only for the duration of a swing. I watched a single warrior for as long as I could bear it. He was below me in the northeast corner of the plaza, near the entrance to the skolam, where the children were taken for their morning instruction. He had a chain axe in each hand, the kind of weapon that existed solely to cause maximum damage to flesh, the toothed chains whirring in opposite directions so that anything caught between them would be pulled apart rather than cut. He was not wearing a helmet. His head was bare, and even from 42 floors up I could see the cables. Thick, dark, glistening cables trailing from the base of his skull down into the collar of his armor, each one pulsing faintly like veins. The nails, the things that lived in his brain and told him to kill. His face was a ruin, not from wounds, from expression. His mouth was open so wide that the muscles of his jaw had distorted, pulled back beyond the natural range of the human face, exposing teeth that were too large and too many, stained dark with old blood. His eyes were open, but there was nothing behind them. No intelligence, no calculation, no malice. Nothing. Just the empty, perfect focus of an organism that had been reduced to a single function. He killed 14 people in the time it took me to count them. I know because I was doing what I always did. I was recording. Not on my cogitator, not with a stylus and a data pad. In my head. 14, 2 of them were children. I watched them die, and I recorded the number, and the number sat in my brain next to all the other numbers that lived there. The grain allotments and the census figures and the water purification quotients, and it did not feel any different. It was just another entry in a ledger that nobody would ever read. Malaya was the one who pulled me away from the window. She grabbed my arm hard, her fingers digging into the flesh above my elbow, and she said my name 3 times before I heard her. Torven, Torven, Torven. Her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away, muffled by the pressure in my chest, by the vibration that was now so intense that I could feel it in my eyeballs. She said we had to move. She said the stairwells. She said down. I looked at her face and saw something I had never seen there before, not in 8 years of sitting next to her, sharing recaf, arguing about superstitions and data entry protocols. I saw someone who understood that the world she had known that morning no longer existed. It was in her eyes, a particular kind of emptiness. Not fear, not shock, not grief. The absence of the thing that had previously occupied the space where those emotions lived. The machinery of normal life, the gears and cogs and pulleys of everyday expectation, all of it gone, stripped away in an instant, leaving nothing but the bare fact of being alive in a place where being alive was no longer the default condition. I let her pull me. We moved through the 42nd floor in a crowd of gray tunics, 300 scribes funneling toward the central stairwell, stumbling over fallen files and broken glass and the detritus of a working day that had ended without warning. Garavic was ahead of us, his bulk pushing a path through the press of bodies. Old Prothus was somewhere behind, moving slowly, still blinking the sleep from his eyes, a man who had woken from a nap into the end of the world. The emergency lighting had come on, bathing everything in a sickly amber glow that made the dust in the air look like smoke. The stairwell doors were open. People were already on the stairs, pouring down from the upper floors, a river of gray tunics flowing toward the ground level, toward the exits, toward the streets where the things in red armor were waiting. I stopped at the stairwell door. Something stopped me. Not the vibration this time. Something else. A thought. A clean, cold, arithmetical thought that cut through the noise and the fear and the pressure like a blade through paper. I grabbed Malaya's arm and I pulled her back, and I said, "Not down." She stared at me. I said it again. Not down. Down is where they are. Down is the plaza. Down is the killing ground. We need to go up. She opened her mouth to argue, and I saw the moment the arithmetic reached her, the moment her own mind caught up with what mine had already calculated. The exits were on the ground floor. The ground floor was at the base of a building that had just been hit by a Dreadclaw. The streets outside were full of warriors in red armor with chain weapons. Going down meant going toward them. Every instinct screamed down, because down was the direction of escape, the direction of outside, the direction of away. But away did not exist anymore. There was no away. There was only the interior of a sealed dome on a poisoned world, and every meter you moved toward the ground was a meter closer to the things that were killing everything they found. Malaya understood. Garavic did not. He was already 3 flights down when I shouted after him, and he did not stop, did not look back, did not hear me over the thunder of feet on metal stairs, and the rising wail of sirens, and the distant, muffled cacophony of violence that was bleeding through the building's walls, like water through old plaster. I watched him go. I watched his broad back disappear around the curve of the stairwell, and I knew with the same clinical certainty that I applied to a flawed data set that I would never see him again. The numbers did not lie. The ground floor was death. The stairwell was a funnel. And funnels, I knew from 15 years of studying flowcharts and population movement data, were traps. 7 of us went up. Malaya, Prothus, me. A young woman from the 38th floor, whose name I never learned, who was crying so quietly that I could barely hear her over the ambient noise. A maintenance technician in orange coveralls who had been fixing a light fitting on our floor when the windows blew. A wiry man with oil-stained hands and a tool belt full of things that might, in a better world, have been weapons. And two others, a man and a woman from one of the upper floors, both in the dark blue tunics of the Administratum's financial division, both moving with the stunned mechanical gait of people whose bodies had outrun their minds. 7 of us. 7 out of the thousands who had been in the building that morning. Everyone else went down. We climbed. The Numistral spire had 63 floors, and the upper 20 were largely unused, given over to long-term archival storage and decommissioned office space that had been sealed shut when the Bureau's budget was cut. The stairs above the 42nd floor were dark, lit only by the amber emergency strips in the ceiling, which gave out entirely above the 55th floor. After that, we climbed by touch and memory, one hand on the rail, one hand on the wall, our feet finding each step in the blackness. The sounds from below changed as we climbed. The screaming grew fainter, muffled by distance and intervening floors, but the pressure behind my sternum grew stronger with every flight. It was as if the building itself was a conductor, channeling the violence from the ground floor upward through its bones, and the higher we went, the more clearly we felt it. Not the sound of killing, the feeling of it. The animal joy, the ecstatic fury, the worship of blood and pain and death that bled out of the warriors in red armor, like radiation from a reactor core, invisible and lethal and everywhere. We reached the 58th floor and stopped. Malaya was breathing hard. Prothus was wheezing, his old lungs struggling with the exertion, his hands trembling on the rail. The young woman from the 38th floor had stopped crying and was now completely silent, her face blank, her eyes fixed on nothing. The maintenance technician was the calmest of us. He had been checking each floor as we passed it, testing doors, peering through the small reinforced windows that looked into the corridors beyond. Most of the doors were sealed. The 58th was not. He pushed it open and we went through into a corridor that smelled of dust and old paper and the faint chemical tang of preservation fluid, the kind used to treat the physical archives that the Administratum still maintained alongside its digital records. The 58th floor was a graveyard of information. Rows of shelving units stretched away into the darkness, each one packed with document boxes, data slates, rolled parchments, and bound ledgers going back centuries. The air was dry and cold, the climate control still functioning even in this abandoned section, maintaining the precise temperature and humidity required to preserve paper and vellum. It was quiet here, not the silence of safety, the silence of distance. The violence was still happening below us, still vibrating through the bones of the building, still sending faint tremors through the floor that made the document boxes rattle on their shelves. But the sound of it was gone. Up here, all we could hear was our own breathing and the hum of the climate control units and the soft, rhythmic tick of a chronometer somewhere in the darkness, measuring out seconds that nobody would ever use for anything again. One of the old cogitator banks along the far wall was still active, its screen glowing a faint amber, its internal systems cycling through automated processes that had been running unattended for decades. The maintenance technician noticed it first. He went to it, touched the screen, and the display flickered to life. It was tuned to the Interdome Emergency Vox Network, a communication channel that connected all 17 domes in the equatorial belt. The channel was alive. Not with coordinated emergency traffic, not with the orderly transmissions of a functional command structure, but with the sound of 17 sealed cities dying at the same time. Fragments of voice, overlapping, cutting in and out as transmitter arrays failed or were destroyed. a chaotic mosaic of human terror broadcast on a frequency that nobody was monitoring anymore, because the people who were supposed to monitor it were already dead. I stood in front of the screen and I listened, and what I heard was the end of a world told in broken sentences. Dome 6 reported fires in the commercial district and unconfirmed sightings of armored hostiles in the sublevels. Dome 11 was not transmitting at all, its channel a flat hiss of dead air that said more than words ever could. Dome 3 was transmitting a single word on repeat, an automated distress beacon that had been triggered when the Dome's command post was overrun. Extremis, 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 the machine voice speaking calmly and clearly into the silence of an empty room. Dome 15 had someone alive on the channel, a woman whose voice was raw from screaming, who was describing in fractured, gasping sentences the things that were happening in the habitation blocks. The doors being torn off, the families being dragged out, the sounds from the avenue that she could hear through the walls of whatever room she had locked herself in. She was asking for help. She was asking anyone, anything, any force in the Imperium that could hear her, to please send help. Nobody answered. The channel crackled and hissed, and the woman's voice continued, growing fainter, growing hoarser. And then it stopped, and another fragment took its place, and then another, and then another, each one a window into a different room in the same burning house, each one confirming what I had suspected since the first Dreadclaw hit the Emperor's palm. This was not an attack on one dome. It was an attack on all of them, simultaneously, coordinated, total. The entire equatorial belt of Vithara Secundus was being harvested, dome by dome, like a row of crops falling before the same blade. The technician turned off the cogitator. The screen went dark. Nobody asked him why. Nobody needed to. We spread out among the shelves, not by plan, by instinct. The way animals scatter when they reach cover, each one finding its own shadow, its own gap, its own place to be still and small and unseen. I found myself in a narrow aisle between two towering shelving units, sitting on the floor with my back against a box labeled Census Returns, Dome 4 to 7, Year 3847 to 3853. Malaya was somewhere to my left. I could hear her breathing. The maintenance technician had gone deeper into the floor toward the ventilation access points that he seemed to know instinctively, the way a man knows his own trade. Prothus had lowered himself into a corner near the door, his back to the wall, his eyes closed, not sleeping this time, but simply conserving what was left of himself for whatever came next. The young woman from the 38th floor sat down in the middle of the aisle, cross-legged, and began to rock. Slowly, rhythmically, her arms wrapped around herself, her lips moving without sound. I watched her for a moment, then looked away. There was nothing I could do for her. There was nothing I could do for any of them. My weapons were a stylus and a talent for spotting misplaced decimal points. None of these things were going to help. Time passed. I do not know how much. The chronometer on the 58th floor ticked away in the darkness, but I could not see its face, and my own wrist chrono had cracked when I stumbled on the stairs. Minutes or hours. It felt like both. The vibration in my chest ebbed and flowed, surging whenever the violence below intensified, fading when it paused. I learned to read it like a gauge, the way I would read a data stream on my cogitator. Strong pulse, killing happening nearby. Weak pulse, killing happening further away. No pulse, nothing alive left to kill. The pulse never stopped entirely. Not once. It waxed and it waned, but it was always there, always present, that alien heartbeat drumming away behind my sternum, telling me that the things in red armor were still out there, still moving, still doing the only thing they knew how to do. The maintenance technician came back. His name was Dreven, he told us, and he had been working in the spire for 9 years, and he knew the building the way I knew a data set, intimately, structurally, from the foundations to the antenna array on the roof. He had found the ventilation shafts. The spire's air circulation system ran vertically through the building's core, a network of ducts and shafts that connected every floor, from the sub-level atmospheric processors all the way up to the exhaust vents on the roof. The shafts were narrow, designed for maintenance drones rather than people, but a person could fit inside them if they were not too large. Dreven was small, I was average. Malaya was thin, Prothus was out of the question, and Garavic would have been out of the question if Garavic had not already gone down the stairs into whatever was waiting at the bottom. Dreven said the shafts could take us to the roof. From the roof, he said, we could access the exterior maintenance walkways that ran along the upper rim of the dome. From the walkways, we could reach the emergency airlocks that connected the dome to the external service tunnels used by the Mechanicus atmospheric processor crews. Those tunnels ran underground between the domes, connecting the equatorial network. If we could reach them, we could get out. Not out of the dome. Out of this dome. Into the tunnel network. Into the dark, pressurized corridors that linked Vithara Secundus's sealed cities like veins between organs. It was not a plan, it was a direction. But it was more than I had, and I took it. We did not all go. Prothus could not fit in the shafts, he knew this. He said it plainly, without bitterness, without self-pity, the way a man states a fact that he has already made peace with. He would stay on the 58th floor, he said, among the archives, among the records and the ledgers and the census returns. It was, he said, as good a place as any to wait. I asked him what he was waiting for, and he looked at me with those old, tired eyes, and he said, "Whatever comes." Then he said something else, something that I did not understand at the time. He said, "The numbers never balanced, Torven. In 37 years, they never once balanced, not truly. I always thought it was me, getting old, losing the thread. But it was not me, was it?" He did not wait for an answer. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the wall, and the expression on his face was not fear or resignation, but something older than either, something that looked like the exhaustion of a man who had carried a suspicion for decades without ever finding the courage or the words to speak it aloud. I did not argue. I did not ask him what he meant. I was too focused on the shafts, on the route upward, on the next step in the sequence of steps that might keep me alive for another hour. But his words lodged in me like a bone in the throat, and later in the hidden room on the 60th floor, when I held the manifests in my hands and the truth spilled out of them like blood from a wound, I thought of Prothus, and I understood what he had been trying to tell me. And I understood that he had known, or suspected, or felt in his gut the thing that his mind could never prove, that the numbers were not wrong because someone had made a mistake. The numbers were wrong because someone had made them wrong on purpose, and 37 years of faithful service had not been enough to see the lie, only to sense its shadow. The two from the financial division refused to enter the shafts. The man said he would rather take his chances on the stairs. The woman said nothing. She simply sat down next to Prothus and stared at the wall, and the blankness in her face told me that she had already left, that whatever part of her had been capable of making decisions had shut down, and what remained was just a body, sitting, breathing, waiting for whatever comes. The young woman from the 38th floor continued rocking, and we left her there. We left all of them there. Malaya, Dreven, and me. 3 of us. 3 out of 7. The ventilation shaft was exactly as narrow as Dreven had described. I am not a large man, but I am not a small one either, and the duct was a tight fit, the metal walls pressing against my shoulders on both sides, the ceiling close enough to brush the back of my head when I raised it. We moved on hands and knees in single file, Drevon leading, me in the middle, Malaya behind. The shaft was dark. Absolutely, totally, consumingly dark. The kind of dark where you cannot see your hand in front of your face, where the concept of sight becomes meaningless, where the world shrinks to what you can hear and feel and smell. I could hear Drevon ahead of me, the soft scrape of his coveralls against metal, the whisper of his breathing. Behind me, Malaya's hands and knees on the duct floor, steady, rhythmic, keeping pace. And beneath all of it, transmitted through the metal walls of the shaft with terrible clarity, the sounds of the building below us. Boots on stairs, doors being smashed open, screaming, distant but distinct, the kind of screaming that comes not from fear, but from damage, from the body's involuntary response to being broken. They were in the building, the warriors in red armor. They had come inside. Drevon stopped. I bumped into his feet. He whispered, barely audible, a single word. Listen. I listened. Below us, perhaps 10 floors down, there was a sound like a heavy blade being dragged along a wall, a grinding, scraping, deliberate sound, the sound of something hard cutting a line through plaster and stone, carving a mark as it walked. And behind the scraping, footsteps. Not the rapid, purposeful footsteps of a soldier clearing a building. Slow footsteps. Heavy, measured. The footsteps of something that was not in a hurry because it knew, with absolute certainty, that nothing in this building could hurt it, and nothing in this building could escape it, and every living thing between its feet and the roof was simply a meal that had not yet been consumed. We moved faster. Drevon navigated the shaft network with the confidence of a man who had spent years crawling through these ducts, maintaining the air filtration units and repairing the circulation fans. He took turns without hesitation, leading us upward through junctions and connectors that I could not see and would not have recognized even if I could. The shaft angled steeply at one point, almost vertical, and we had to brace ourselves with our elbows and knees and inch upward in the dark, muscles burning, lungs heaving in the stale air, sweat running down my face and dripping onto the metal beneath me. The sounds from below grew fainter as we climbed, but the drumming behind my ribs remained constant, a relentless pulse that told me they were still there, still moving, still killing, floor by floor by floor, working their way upward through the Numistral spire like fire climbing a chimney. We passed a horizontal junction around the 54th floor, and that is where I heard the knocking. It came from below, from a side duct that branched off to the left and angled downward toward the floor beneath us. A rhythmic, frantic rapping of knuckles on metal, and behind it, voices, muffled, desperate, barely intelligible through the layers of ductwork, but unmistakably human. Someone was in the shaft below us. More than one someone. I could hear at least 3 distinct voices, maybe 4, overlapping, calling out in the dark, saying the same things that anyone would say in that situation. Help! Please, we are here. Please! Is anyone there? Please! One of the voices was high-pitched and thin, the voice of a child, and the word it kept repeating was not help or please, but a name, over and over, a name that I could not quite make out through the metal, calling for someone who was not answering. Drevon stopped. I stopped. Malaya stopped. The 3 of us lay in the dark, shoulder to shoulder in a duct barely wide enough for one person, and listened to the knocking and the voices and the child calling a name into the dark, and nobody moved and nobody spoke, and the silence between us was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I knew what Drevon was thinking because I was thinking the same thing. The side duct was narrow. It led downward. Downward was where the killing was. If we went down, if we followed the voices, if we tried to reach the people who were trapped below us, we would be moving toward the warriors in red, not away from them. Every minute we spent in this building was a minute closer to being found. The mathematics were simple. The mathematics were always simple. 3 of us, alive, moving upward with a chance, however thin, of reaching the roof. 3 of us plus 4 strangers and a child, moving downward, moving slowly, making noise with no chance at all. I did the mathematics. I lay in the dark and I ran the numbers cleanly and without sentiment, and the numbers said, "Keep moving." The numbers said, "Upward." The numbers said, "Those people below you are already dead. They just do not know it yet, and if you go down there, you will be dead with them, and the net result will be 7 deaths instead of 4. The numbers were correct. The numbers are always correct, and I hated them. I hated them with a purity and an intensity that I had never felt before, because the numbers did not hear the child's voice. The numbers did not know the name it was calling. The numbers did not care that somewhere below me in the dark a small person was looking for someone who would never come. The numbers only knew that 3 was better than 0, and alive was better than dead, and the optimal outcome was the one that preserved the greatest number of surviving units, and the people in the duct below were not surviving units. They were a subtraction, a negative entry, a line to be drawn through. Malaya's hand found mine in the dark. She squeezed once, tight, brief, the kind of grip that says, "I know, and I am sorry, and there is nothing we can do," all in the pressure of 5 fingers against a palm. I squeezed back. Drevan began to move again. We crawled past the junction. The knocking continued behind us, growing fainter with each meter, and the child's voice faded into the general hum of the shaft, and I added 4 to the number in my head, the running tally that I had been keeping since the plaza, the count of the dead that I had personally witnessed or chosen not to save. And the number was large now, much too large for a man whose biggest professional challenge that morning had been a 12% grain surplus in Dome 17. We passed a junction with a grated cover that looked down into one of the lower floors, and Dravehan whispered for us to stop and be silent. While we waited, pressed flat against the metal, Malaya's lips close to my ear, she said something that I almost missed beneath the ambient drone of the ventilation system. She said, "I used to run the numbers twice." I turned my head slightly. Her face was invisible in the dark, but I could feel her breath against my cheek, warm and quick. She said, "The population figures for the southern clusters. I ran them twice every quarter. The first run always came up short. Always. Not by much, a fraction of a percent. But consistently, every cycle, the same direction. Fewer people than there should have been. I thought it was a rounding error. I thought it was the sampling methodology. I wrote it up in 3 separate reports over 5 years, flagged it for review, recommended a procedural audit. Nothing came of it. The reports were acknowledged, filed, and forgotten. After the 3rd one, my supervisor called me into his office and told me, very calmly, very politely, that my diligence was appreciated, but that certain discrepancies were within acceptable tolerances and did not warrant further investigation. He used that exact phrase, acceptable tolerances, and I accepted it, Torven. I accepted it because he was my supervisor and I was a scribe, and the hierarchy existed for a reason, and who was I to question acceptable tolerances when people with more authority and more information than me had already decided that the matter was closed? She paused. In the dark, in the duct, in a building full of things that wanted to kill us. She paused, and the silence was heavy with the weight of a confession that had been waiting years to be spoken. She said, "But I never stopped running the numbers twice, and they never stopped coming up short." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had seen the shadow. The same shadow I had seen in the grain surplus. The same shadow that Prothus had felt in 37 years of numbers that never quite balanced. We had all seen it, each of us from our own angle, each of us in our own way, and none of us had pushed hard enough to find out what was casting it. We had trusted the system. We had trusted the hierarchy. We had trusted that the people above us knew what the numbers meant, and that their silence was wisdom rather than complicity. And we had been wrong. All of us. Every faithful, diligent, obedient scribe in every gray tunic on every floor of the numistral spire had been wrong, and the wrongness had not protected us, and the system we had trusted was now collapsing around us in blood and fire, and the shadow behind the numbers was standing in the corridors below with a chain axe in its hand. I pressed my face to the grate and looked through the narrow slats and saw a corridor lit by flickering emergency strips, and in the corridor I saw what the warriors in red armor left behind when they moved through a space. The walls were painted, not with words, not with symbols, with blood. Great arterial sprays of it flung across the plaster in patterns that had no meaning and no intent, that were simply the byproduct of violence so extreme that the human body could not contain its own fluids. The floor was covered in things that I will not describe. I will say only that I could not, at first, identify them as parts of people. They were too deformed, too scattered, too thoroughly destroyed to be recognizable as anything that had once been whole. It was as if the bodies had been disassembled, taken apart not with surgical precision, but with brute force, pulled and torn and hammered into shapes that bore no resemblance to the original. And there, at the end of the corridor, standing in the ruin with its back to me, was one of them. I saw it from perhaps 20 meters away, looking down through a ventilation grate at a slight angle, and even so, even from that distance, even through the narrow slats of the grate, the sight of it stopped my breath and stilled my heart and made the universe very, very small. It was facing away from me, which was the only reason I was still alive. From this close, details emerged that 42 floors of distance had hidden. The layers of its war plate were visible now, not a uniform red, but a palimpsest of older colors beneath. Darker browns and blacks, the geological strata of 10,000 years of war. The fresh blood running down its armor in thin rivulets had a quality that the distance of the plaza had mercifully obscured, a viscosity, a thickness that made it look less like liquid and more like something the armor was secreting, as if the ceramite itself were bleeding. And on its back, mounted on a crude iron rack that jutted from between its shoulder blades, a brass symbol that I recognized from the prohibited texts that the ecclesiarchy sometimes confiscated from the lower habs. The skull rune, the mark of Khorne, the blood god, the patron of butchers and berserkers and all those who killed for the pure, ecstatic joy of killing. The warrior was standing still, not moving, not killing, not howling, just standing. Its head was tilted back slightly, and from the angle of its posture I thought it might be looking at the ceiling, or through the ceiling, at something that existed beyond the physical structure of the building. Its shoulders rose and fell with deep, slow breaths that I could hear even through the grate. Each exhalation a wet, rasping sound like a man breathing through a punctured lung. The cables at the base of its skull, the butcher's nails, were twitching, pulsing. I could see the movement from 20 meters away, a rhythmic spasm that ran along each cable in sequence, like the firing of synapses, like a heartbeat. It was the heartbeat in my chest. I understood that now. I was feeling the pulse of the nails. Somehow, impossibly, the vibration of those cortical implants was bleeding through the air, through the walls, through the building, through the ventilation shaft, and into the bones of a sensus scribe who had no psychic sensitivity, no warp-touched gift, nothing but a pair of human ears and a human ribcage that happened to resonate at the same frequency as the agony of a 10,000-year-old killing machine. It moved, without warning, without transition from stillness to motion. One moment it was standing, the next it was running. It turned and it ran, back down the corridor, back toward the stairwell, back toward whatever killing it had left unfinished on the floor below. And as it turned, I caught a glimpse of its face. No helmet, like the one I had watched in the plaza, and the face was the same distorted jaw, the same exposed teeth, the same emptiness behind the eyes. But there was something else there, too, something I had not seen from the tower window, something that was only visible from this close, through this narrow grate, in this dim and flickering light. Tears. The warrior was crying, not weeping. The muscles of its face were locked in that permanent rictus of fury and pain, and no human emotion could possibly have found expression through those ruined features. But the tear ducts were functioning. Fluid was running from the corners of its eyes, cutting tracks through the blood on its face, and whether it was tears or discharge or simply a mechanical byproduct of the damage the nails had done to its nervous system, I do not know. But I saw it, and I will remember it, because in that moment, looking down through the grate at a thing that had murdered its way through an entire floor of an administrative building without pausing for breath, I felt something that I was not prepared for. Not fear, not hatred, pity. A brief, irrational, utterly inappropriate flash of pity for a creature that had once been human and was now a prisoner of its own skull, locked in a cage of pain and rage from which the only key was the act of murder. The pity lasted about 2 seconds. Then the warrior was gone, and the screaming from the floor below resumed, and the pity evaporated like water on a hot plate, and what was left was the same cold, clean, arithmetical thinking that had kept me alive so far. Move. Up. Now. Do not stop. Do not look down again. Do not think about pity. Think about the shafts. Think about the roof. Think about the maintenance walkways and the airlocks and the tunnels. Think about numbers. Think about survival. We climbed! The shaft leveled out somewhere around the 60th floor. Dreven led us through a horizontal section that ran the length of the building, parallel to the corridor below. And here the duct widened enough that we could move on our stomachs rather than our hands and knees, dragging ourselves forward with our elbows. The metal beneath us was warm, heated by the air from the atmospheric processors that still pushed manufactured atmosphere through the building's lungs, even as its body was being torn apart floor by floor. The warmth should have been comforting. It was not. It felt like the building was alive, like we were crawling through the intestines of some vast organism that had been mortally wounded but had not yet stopped breathing. Dreven found an access panel. He worked it open with a tool from his belt, a flat-headed pry that he operated with the practiced economy of a man who had opened 10,000 access panels in his career and could do it in the dark by muscle memory alone. The panel came free with a soft clang that sounded, in the confined silence of the shaft, like a gunshot. We all froze. I held my breath and listened. Below us, muffled by metal and distance, the sounds of the invasion continued, but they were different now. Fainter, more sporadic. The constant roar of chain blades had been replaced by something intermittent, bursts of violence separated by stretches of near silence, as if the warriors in red were running out of things to kill on the lower floors and were searching for more. Hunting. That was the word that came to me. They were hunting. The access panel opened into a room I had never seen before. Not a corridor, not an office, not a storage chamber. A room. Circular, perhaps 10 meters across, with a low ceiling and no windows. The ventilation duct that connected it to the shaft network had been sealed at some point, a welded plate covering its interior opening, But decades of thermal cycling and the vibration of the atmospheric processors had cracked the welds and loosened the plate enough for Drevon's pry to finish the job. Whoever had built this room had intended it to be airtight, sealed, accessible only through the door. The building's own age had betrayed that intention. The walls were lined with cogitator banks, older models than the ones on the working floors, their casings yellowed with age, their screens dark. In the center of the room there was a desk, and on the desk there were documents. Physical documents, the old kind, printed on actual vellum, the kind that the Administratum reserved for records of the highest classification. The room smelled of dust and preservative, and something else, something faintly metallic that I could not immediately identify. Drevon dropped through the access panel first, landing with a soft thud. Malaya followed. I came last, lowering myself through the gap and hanging for a moment from the lip of the shaft before letting go. The floor was stone, not the prefabricated composite of the working floors. Old stone, foundation stone, the kind that had been laid when the spire was first built, 8,000 years ago, in the early days of the colony. I looked around. The room had a single door, heavy, reinforced, set into the wall opposite the access panel. It was sealed. A keypad lock, green light glowing faintly in the dark, still powered, still functional. Whatever this room was, it was important enough to warrant its own independent power supply. Malaya was already at the desk. She had picked up one of the documents and was reading it by the glow of the cogitator standby lights, her face close to the vellum, her lips moving slightly as she worked through the formal high Gothic script. I watched her face change. It was a subtle thing, a tightening around the eyes, a flattening of the mouth, the kind of expression that appears when someone reads something that does not match their understanding of the world and has to rebuild that understanding from the ground up, line by line, word by word. She put the document down and picked up another one, and another, and another. Her hands were shaking. I took the first document from the desk and read it myself. It was a tithe manifest, standard format, standard layout, the kind of document I had processed hundreds of times in my career. Origin world, Vithara Secundus, tithe grade, exactus prima. Assessed contribution, 3.7 million metric tons mineral ore, 14,000 units industrial equipment, 850,000 units processed foodstuffs, 120,000 units human labor. Standard. Ordinary. The kind of numbers that filled the archives on every floor of every administrative building on every tithe-paying world in the Imperium. But beneath the standard fields, in a section of the form that I had never seen before, that I did not even know existed, there was an additional entry. It was written in a different hand, a cramped, angular script that did not match the neat, bureaucratic calligraphy of the rest of the document. It read, Supplementary Allocation, Ref, Mandate Crimson, Designation, Tribute Sanguine, Quantity, 8,000 souls processed, Destination, Undisclosed, Authority, Prefect Sanguinary, Dome, Governance Council. I read it twice, then I read it a third time. The words did not change. They sat on the vellum in that cramped, angular hand, and they said exactly what they appeared to say. 8,000 souls, processed, tribute sanguine. I understood each word individually, and I understood their meaning collectively, and the understanding settled into me like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples outward through everything I had ever believed about my world and my work and my place in the machinery of the Imperium. Vithara Secundus had been paying a blood tithe, not to the Imperium, not to the Emperor, to something else. 8,000 human beings taken from the population, processed, whatever that meant, and sent somewhere that the manifest did not name, under the authority of someone called the Prefect Sanguinary, a title that did not exist in any Administratum hierarchy I had ever encountered. I looked at the dates on the manifest. It was old, centuries old, and there were more beneath it, stacked on the desk in neat piles, each one covering a different fiscal cycle, each one bearing the same supplementary allocation in the same cramped hand. 8,000 here, 12,000 there, 6,000 in a lean year. The numbers stretched back as far as I could see, document after document, decade after decade, century after century. A hidden ledger, a shadow accounting, a second set of books running parallel to the official records that I and every other scribe in the Bureau had been maintaining with such meticulous care, recording a trade that we were never meant to know about. The census discrepancies. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow, and I actually staggered, my hand going to the edge of the desk for support. The census discrepancies, the mismatched population counts, the numbers that never quite added up, the figures that were always slightly off, the anomalies that I had spent my entire career chasing and correcting and filing away as data entry errors. They were not errors. They were gaps. Gaps where the people had been. The surplus grain in Dome 17 that had started my morning, the 12% that should not have been there, that only made sense if the population was smaller than reported. It was not a transposed digit. It was not a mistake. It was the shadow of 8,000 people who had been removed from the population and expunged from the records, their absence papered over with adjusted figures and falsified counts, the entire apparatus of the Bureau unwittingly maintaining a fiction that hid the bleeding underneath. I had been part of it. For 15 years, every time I had corrected a census figure, every time I had adjusted an allotment to match a population count that did not reflect reality, every time I had closed a discrepancy with a neat entry and a reference number, I had been helping to conceal a crime so vast that it defied comprehension. Not knowingly, not willingly. I was a tool, a cogitator with a pulse, running the program that had been written for me, producing the outputs that were required, never questioning the inputs because the inputs came from above, and above was where the authority lived. The Prefect Sanguinary, whoever they were, had built a system that used the very diligence of people like me to maintain its own camouflage. My precision, my attention to detail, my obsessive need to make the numbers balance. All of it had been turned against me, weaponized, made to serve a purpose that I would have rejected with every fiber of my being if I had known it existed. And then I found the names, not in the manifests, in a supplementary register, bound separately, tucked beneath the main stack of documents as if it had been placed there as an afterthought or a record of last resort. It was a list. Names, dates, dome of origin, habitation block, occupation. Thousands of entries, handwritten in that same cramped, angular script, each one a person, each one a life reduced to a line on a page. I turned the pages. I scanned the columns. I was looking for something, and I did not want to find it, and I knew I was going to find it, and when I did, the world did not end again, because it had already ended twice and there was nothing left to break. But something inside me broke. Something structural, something that had been holding the rest of me together, the way a keystone holds an arch. And when it gave way, the rest followed, silently, completely, without drama. Just a collapse. Just a man standing in a hidden room, holding a ledger, looking at a name written in ink on vellum 7 years ago. Adarin Gale, Dome 9, Habitation Block 12, Textile Worker, date of processing, the exact date she had not come home from her shift, the exact date I had filed missing persons report, 7741-Sigma-Dome 9, the exact date the system had closed around her absence and filled it in with new numbers, and told me, in its calm and patient bureaucratic voice, that certain discrepancies were within acceptable tolerances and did not warrant further investigation. She had not disappeared. She had been collected, processed, sent, fed into the machinery of the compact like a bolt of cloth into a loom, and what came out the other side was not a person, but a payment, a line in a ledger, an entry that balanced an account that I had not known existed, in a transaction that I had spent my entire career helping to conceal. My sister, my loud, careless, furious sister, who had said the domes were cages and the people inside them were inventory. She had been right. She had been exactly, precisely, mathematically right, and they had taken her for it, or despite it, or regardless of it, because the compact did not care about right or wrong. The compact only cared about numbers. And she was a number. And I had filed her away. Malaya put down the last document and looked at me. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. The world had ended twice in one morning, first with the Dreadclaws, and now with this, and there was no form to fill out, no reference number to assign, no procedure in any manual that covered the discovery that your entire professional life had been a lie, and that the institution you had served with such dedication had been feeding your neighbors to something unspeakable in the dark. Dravehan had been silent throughout this. He was standing by the sealed door, running his hands along its edges, examining the lock mechanism with professional interest. He had not read the documents. He did not need to. He was a maintenance technician. His world was ducts and wires and circulation fans, and whatever secrets the administration was keeping were as distant from his daily reality as the stars above the dome. But he had found something at the door that interested him. He called us over. The keypad lock was standard Administratum issue, the kind I had seen on every restricted area in the building. But behind it, partially concealed by a metal casing, there was a second lock. Older. Much older. Not a keypad, but a biometric scanner, the kind that read blood. A pinprick device mounted in a small recess, designed to take a drop of blood from the user's fingertip and match it against an encoded genetic signature. Drevan said he had never seen one in the building before. Malaya said she had seen them in the sub-levels, on the doors that led to the atmospheric processor control rooms, the ones that only the senior Mechanicus adepts were allowed to access. I said nothing because I was still thinking about the manifests and the 8,000 souls, and the prefect sanguinary and the monstrous patient, centuries-long machinery of hidden murder that had been operating beneath my feet, behind my desk, inside the very numbers I had spent my life tending. The door would not open without the blood key. We could not go through. Dravan said we could go back into the shafts, continue upward, reach the roof another way. Malaya said yes. I said wait. I do not know what compelled me to go back to the desk. Curiosity, perhaps. The same impulse that had driven me to chase discrepancies for 15 years, the need to see the complete picture, to follow the numbers to their conclusion, to find the error and name it. I went back and I looked more carefully at the documents, sorting through them, reading the supplementary allocations one after another, tracing the pattern across the centuries. The numbers were not random. They followed a cycle. Every 8 years, the tribute increased. Every 8 years exactly, without deviation. 8,000, then 16,000, then 24,000. And at the end of each cycle, a notation that I had missed on my first reading, written in the same cramped hand. Payment received. Account settled. The compact holds. The compact. I did not know what the compact was. I do not know now. But I know what it implies. A compact is an agreement, a deal, a transaction between two parties in which something is given and something is received. Vithara Secundus had been giving blood. 8,000 lives at a time in exchange for something. Protection, perhaps. The dome's survival. The continued functioning of the atmospheric processors that kept the air breathable and the poison out. Or something else entirely, something that the documents did not specify. Something that the Prefect Sanguinary and the Dome Governance Council had deemed worth the price of a few thousand anonymous lives every fiscal cycle. I thought about the numbers. I ran the calculations in my head, quickly and cleanly and without sentiment. 8,000 lives, increasing by 8,000 every 8 years, sustained over centuries. The total was staggering. Millions of people taken from the domes of Vithara Secundus and processed and sent into the dark. And the rest of us, the survivors, the ones who remained, had gone on with our lives and filed our reports and balanced our ledgers and never once asked where the missing people had gone. And now the Dreadclaws had come, and the warriors in red armor were in the building. And I stood in a hidden room on the 60th floor of the Numistral spire, holding a vellum manifest that described centuries of secret murder, and the alien heartbeat behind my ribs was stronger than it had ever been. A pounding, insistent rhythm that shook my whole frame and blurred my vision, and I thought, the compact is broken. Whatever deal was struck, whatever balance was maintained, whatever dark arrangement kept the blood flowing on schedule and the payment received and the account settled, it is broken now. They are not here to collect the tribute. They are here to collect the debt. Drevan called to me from the access panel. We needed to move. The sounds from below were changing again, growing closer, the bursts of violence moving upward through the building. They were coming, floor by floor, room by room, clearing the spire the way a predator clears a burrow, working inward from the edges, driving everything alive toward the center where it could be cornered and killed. We did not have much time. I put the manifest down. I climbed back into the shaft. We moved. The next 20 minutes were a blur of metal and darkness and the sound of our own breathing. Drevan led us through the upper reaches of the ventilation network, through ducts that were narrower and older and less well-maintained than the ones below, their walls furred with decades of accumulated dust, their joints leaking thin streams of recycled air that whispered against our skin as we crawled. Twice we had to stop and wait as sounds passed below us. The heavy tread of ceramite boots, the grinding of weapons against walls, the wet, tearing sounds that I had learned to associate with the opening of sealed doors and the people who had been hiding behind them. Twice we lay flat in the dark, barely breathing, listening to murder happening 10 meters below our bodies, separated from it by nothing more than a sheet of metal and a few centimeters of building material. And the resonance in my bones was so intense that I was certain, absolutely certain, that the warrior below could feel it too, could sense the resonance of its own nails reflected back by the trembling bones of a scribe in the duct above, and that at any moment a chain axe would come through the floor of the shaft, and that would be the end. It did not happen. Not yet. We crawled on. The roof access was a hatch at the top of a vertical shaft, sealed with a manual wheel lock that Drevan turned with both hands, the mechanism stiff with disuse, groaning as it gave way. The hatch swung open and light poured in, not the amber of emergency strips, but the cold, gray light of the dome's exterior, the filtered glow of manufactured atmosphere seen from above. We pulled ourselves out of the shaft and onto the roof of the Numistral spire, and for the first time since the windows had blown in, I could see. The dome of Vithara Secundus stretched away in all directions, a vast arched canopy of armor, glass, and plasteel lattice that rose to a peak perhaps 2 kilometers above the ground. From the roof of the spire, the highest point in the administrative district, I could see the full interior of the dome, and what I saw was a world on fire. Not literal fire, though there were fires burning in several places. Columns of black smoke rising from the commercial district and the transit hub and the hab blocks along the southern wall. The fire I saw was human. It was the fire of a population in collapse, of 250,000 people trapped inside a sealed structure with approximately 60 transhuman killing machines, all of them trying to run and having nowhere to run to. From up here, the people looked like insects, streams of them clogging the avenues, pooling in the plazas, breaking and reforming around obstacles like water flowing through a maze. And among them, visible even at this distance by their crimson armor and the red mist that seemed to hang around them like an aura, the World Eaters moved. I use the word moved, but it does not capture what I saw. They flowed. They poured through the streets like a liquid, splitting around buildings, rejoining on the other side, always moving, always forward, always toward the densest concentrations of fleeing people. They did not chase. They did not need to. The dome was sealed. The atmospheric locks were closed. The poison sky above the dome ensured that nobody could leave, and the warriors in red knew this, and their movements reflected this knowledge, a patient, almost leisurely quality to their advance that was somehow more terrifying than haste would have been. They had all the time in the world. The dome was a killing jar, and everything inside it was already dead. It simply had not stopped moving yet. I saw something then that I wish I had not seen. On the far side of the dome, near the southern atmospheric processing plant, there was a crowd, several thousand people, packed into the open ground between the plant and the hab blocks, pressing against the emergency airlock that led to the external service tunnels, the same tunnels that Dreven had described as our escape route. They were trying to get out. The airlock was sealed, as all airlocks were sealed when the dome's defense protocols activated, and the crowd was crushing itself against it, a mass of bodies driven by desperation against a door that would not open. And from the north, moving down the main boulevard toward the processing plant, a line of crimson figures was advancing. Perhaps 20 of them, shoulder to shoulder, chain axes buzzing, filling the width of the boulevard like a wall of red iron. They were not running. They were walking, taking each step in unison, a slow, grinding advance that ate the distance between them and the crowd at the airlock, with the inevitability of a closing vice. Between the advancing line and the crowd, someone had tried to make a stand. I could see them from the roof, a thin formation of figures in the dark gray flak armor of the veteran dome enforcers, perhaps 40 of them, arranged across the width of the boulevard in a firing line. They had combat shotguns and shock mauls and a single heavy stubber mounted on a wheeled carriage that 2 of them were struggling to position behind an overturned cargo hauler. They were not soldiers. They were law enforcement, trained for crowd control and petty crime, and the occasional hab block disturbance. Their heaviest tactical scenario, the one they drilled for twice a year, was a full-scale riot. They had never been trained for this. Nothing in the history of Vithara Secundus had prepared anyone for this. But they were there, and they had formed a line, and the heavy stubber opened up as the red wall advanced, the muzzle flash visible even from this distance, a rapid flickering of light that sent a stream of heavy-caliber rounds downrange into the crimson figures. I watched the rounds hit. I watched them spark and ricochet off ceramite plate, pockmarking the ancient armor, chipping paint and dislodging fragments of bone trophy, but doing nothing, absolutely nothing to slow the advance. It was like watching someone throw stones at a glacier. The physics were technically correct. The projectile was striking the target. But the scale was wrong, catastrophically wrong, and the disparity between the force being applied and the force that would have been required was so vast that the effort became a kind of obscenity, a cruel joke told by the universe, at the expense of 40 men and women who had put on their armor that morning, believing that armor meant something. The red wall did not break stride. It walked through the firing line the way a man walks through a curtain, the chain axes rising and falling with a mechanical regularity that was almost rhythmic, almost musical, a percussion of murder that took less than 20 seconds to silence every weapon and every voice in the enforcer formation. The heavy stubber fired until the very last moment. I could see the muzzle flash stuttering, the barrel traversing left and right as the gunner tried to find a weak point, a joint, a gap, anything that would stop one of these things for even a second. There was no weak point. There was no gap. There was just red armor and red fury and the wet terminal sound of chain teeth meeting flesh. And then the stubber stopped and the formation was gone, and the red wall walked on toward the crowd at the airlock, as if the 40 enforcers had been nothing more than a brief change in the texture of the ground beneath their boots. The crowd saw them. I could tell because the mass of bodies at the airlock changed shape, compressing against the door with renewed frenzy. People climbing over each other, clawing at the metal, screaming in voices I could not hear, but could imagine with perfect clarity. And then the red wall reached them, and the mass changed shape again, this time collapsing inward, contracting, shrinking, as the chain axes did their work, and the bodies fell, and the boulevard turned the color of the armor that was walking through it. I looked away. For the first and only time since the invasion began, I looked away. Not because I could not bear to watch, though I could not. Because looking served no purpose. I was a witness, and I had witnessed, and the record was complete. Whatever I had seen, I had seen. No amount of further observation would change it, or explain it, or make it anything other than what it was. The systematic extermination of a population by an enemy that did not want territory, did not want resources, did not want submission or compliance or surrender. An enemy that wanted blood, only blood. Blood for its own sake, blood as currency, blood as prayer, blood for the blood god. Drevhan was already at the edge of the roof, looking for the maintenance walkway. He found it, a narrow metal catwalk that ran along the outside of the building, bolted to the exterior wall at the level of the roof, connecting the spire to the dome's structural lattice. The walkway was exposed, open to the interior of the dome on one side and to the armored skin of the building on the other. It was designed for maintenance drones, not people, and the railing was low and the surface was narrow, and the wind, manufactured wind, pushed by the atmospheric processors in their endless cycle, pulled at our clothes and our hair and made every step a negotiation between forward motion and the 63-floor drop to the ground. We moved along the walkway, Draven first, then me, then Malaya. Single file, one hand on the rail, one hand on the wall, eyes forward, feet flat, step by careful step. The walkway curved around the building and then angled upward, following the lattice toward the dome's upper structure, where the armor glass panels met the plasteel framework in a web of girders and supports that formed the dome's skeleton. The airlock was up there, according to Drevan, a service hatch used by the Mechanicus crews who maintained the exterior panels, accessible from the lattice, connected to the tunnel network by a pressurized corridor that ran through the dome's wall and down into the bedrock. We were halfway along the walkway when the spire shook, a deep structural tremor that ran through the building from base to crown, shaking the walkway so hard that I lost my footing and went down on one knee, my hands clawing at the metal grating. Malaya stumbled behind me and caught herself on the rail. Draven did not stumble. He stopped. He turned. He looked down. From our position on the walkway, we could see the base of the spire, 63 floors below. The Dreadclaw that had hit the building's foundation was still there, its mechanical claws embedded in the stonework, its armored hull steaming in the manufactured air. But it was not alone anymore. Around it, at the base of the spire, a crowd had gathered. Not civilians, not refugees, people in robes, dark robes, crimson-trimmed, their heads covered, their faces hidden in deep hoods. They were kneeling, dozens of them arranged in concentric circles around the Dreadclaw, their arms raised, their voices raised, chanting something that I could not hear from this height, but could feel in my chest, in the vibration, in the alien heartbeat that had been my companion all day. They were worshipping. In the middle of the slaughter, in the midst of the invasion, in the shadow of a building that was being cleared floor by floor by transhuman berserkers, these people were kneeling in the blood of their neighbors and praying to the thing that had killed them. Cultists. The word surfaced from somewhere in the back of my mind, from half-remembered ecclesiarchy sermons and prohibited text warnings and the lurid stories that circulated in the lower halves about the followers of the dark powers. Khorne cultists, blood worshippers, people who had given themselves to the same god that the warriors in red served, who had invited this, who had wanted this, who had opened the door and ushered in the things that were killing us all. I thought about the manifests, the compact, the prefect sanguinary, and I understood with a clarity that was like a blade in my gut that the cultists at the base of the spire were not outsiders. They were not invaders. They were locals. They were people I might have passed in the street, might have shared a cargo lifter with, might have processed the census records for. They were citizens of Vithara Secundus, and they had been here all along, hidden in plain sight, embedded in the population like a tumor in an organ, growing slowly, patiently, invisibly, until the day came when the growth was large enough to kill the host. And then I saw something that made the vertigo worse, that turned the sick spinning in my stomach into a free fall that had no bottom. One of the kneeling figures, in the second ring from the center, directly beside the Dreadclaw's embedded claw, had thrown back its hood. The distance was considerable, 63 floors, and the light was the flickering amber of a dome in crisis. But I knew that shape. I knew those shoulders, that bulk, that particular way of holding the head tilted slightly forward, as if perpetually squinting at something. Garavic. My Garavic. The man who had sat to my left for 8 years, who had attacked his cogitator with those thick fingers, who had gone down the stairs when I had shouted up. He had not gone down to escape. He had gone down to join them. He was kneeling in the blood of his neighbors, his arms raised, his mouth open in a chant I could not hear, and the expression on his face, even from this distance, even through the distortion of height and light and disbelief, was rapture, pure, uncomplicated, transcendent rapture, the face of a man who had been waiting for this day his entire life and had finally, at long last, seen it arrive. How long? The question was a knife, turning slowly in my ribs. How long had he been one of them? A year? 5 years? All 8 years that we had sat side by side, his desk against mine, his elbow 2 feet from my elbow, his keystrokes filling the air between us like the ticking of a clock. Had he gone home every evening from the bureau, hung up his gray tunic, put on those crimson-trimmed robes, and knelt in some hidden cellar beneath the hab blocks, praying for the day the sky would break open and the things in red armor would descend? Had he looked at me every morning across the gap between our cogitators and known what was coming and said nothing? And typed and waited? The thought was unbearable. Not because of the betrayal. Betrayal I could understand. Betrayal was a human thing, a thing with motives and reasons and a logic that could be traced, even if the logic was twisted. What was unbearable was the proximity, the intimacy of it. The idea that the enemy had been close enough to touch, close enough to hear breathing, close enough to smell the recaf on, and I had not seen it. I, Torven Geil, the man who found the error. I had missed the biggest error of all, and it had been sitting at the desk next to mine, typing. And then the universe delivered its final commentary on the subject of loyalty and reward. While I watched, while my fingers whitened on the railing and the manufactured wind pulled at my tunic and the dome burned below me, a world-eater emerged from the shattered entrance of the numistral spire. It came out fast, moving at that headlong, lurching run, its chain axe already spinning, its bare head thrown back, the nails pulsing at the base of its skull. It did not pause. It did not assess. It hit the circle of kneeling cultists like a boulder hitting a pond, and it did not stop for them. The first cultist died mid-chant, the axe bisecting the raised arms, and the body beneath them in a single descending stroke. The second died trying to stand. The third died on her knees, still praying. The warrior moved through the circle the way it moved through everything else, with the same indiscriminate, unthinking, mechanical fury. And the cultists died the same way the enforcers had died, and the crowd at the airlock had died, and the children at the skolam had died, with no more ceremony and no less violence, because the thing that killed them did not know the difference between a worshipper and a victim, and would not have cared if it did. The blood of the faithful was the same color as the blood of the innocent. It flowed the same way. It pooled the same way. And whatever God was watching from behind the veil of reality, whatever vast and hungry intelligence was drinking in the carnage like rain, it made no distinction between an offering and a meal. I saw Garavic die. I saw the axe catch him across the chest as he rose from his knees, his arms still raised, his face still wearing that expression of rapture. And the rapture did not have time to become surprise before the teeth tore through his sternum, and the expression ceased to be anything at all. He fell. He fell among his brothers and sisters in the circle, among the blood and the robes and the broken prayers. And he was dead. And the warrior that killed him did not look at him, did not slow for him, did not acknowledge in any way that the thing it had just destroyed had spent its life in service to the same God. It simply moved on to the next body, to the next calorie of rage. Because the blood god does not reward loyalty. The blood god does not recognize devotion. The blood god recognizes only blood, and blood is blood, and it does not matter whose veins it comes from or what prayers were on the lips of the one who bled it. The compact holds. The words from the manifest echoed in my skull, but it did not hold. Whatever bargain had been struck, whatever balance of blood and silence had sustained the arrangement for centuries, it had failed. The tribute had not been enough, or the terms had changed, or the thing on the other end of the compact had grown hungry beyond what a few thousand souls per fiscal cycle could satisfy. And it had sent its champions to collect what was owed, all of it. Every drop, every life, every skull. I wanted to scream at them, the people kneeling around the Dreadclaw, the robed figures with their raised arms and their bloody prayers. I wanted to lean over the railing and scream down at them, 63 floors of fury compressed into a single, wordless howl. But I did not, because it would not have changed anything, and because they would not have heard me, and because I realized with a sick, spiraling vertigo that had nothing to do with the height. I was angry at the wrong people. The cultists had not created the compact. The governance council had. The Administratum had. The system had. The same system that I had served, that I had maintained, that I had oiled and adjusted and calibrated with my little corrections and my little reports and my little reference numbers. The cultists were a symptom. The disease was older and deeper, and it lived in the walls of the numistral spire, in the hidden room on the 60th floor. in the vellum manifests with their cramped, angular script, in the supplementary allocations that no honest scribe was ever meant to see. Malaya touched my arm. "We need to move," she said. Her voice was flat, emptied of everything except the mechanical imperative of survival. I looked at her face and saw that she had reached the same conclusion I had, that the discovery of the manifests had collapsed the last support structure in her understanding of the world, and what was left was a woman moving through the rubble of her own beliefs with no destination and no purpose except the animal need to keep breathing for as long as breathing was possible. We moved. Along the walkway, up the lattice, hand over hand along the structural supports of the dome. The armor glass panels were close enough to touch here, their inner surfaces beaded with condensation, and through them I could see the sky. The real sky, the yellow-brown poison sky of Vithara Secundus, roiling and churning above the dome, and behind it, faintly, the dark shapes of ships in low orbit. The warships that had brought the Dreadclaws, the vessels of the 12th Legion, hanging in the poison sky like predators circling a wounded animal, watching their prey bleed out below. Draven found the service hatch. It was a small oval door set into the base of a lattice junction, flush with the dome's inner surface, marked with the cog and skull of the Mechanicus and the angular runes of the maintenance code. He entered the code, a sequence he had memorized years ago, and the hatch released with a hiss of pressurized air. Beyond it, a short corridor lit by fluorescent strips, clean and white and impossibly ordinary after the nightmare of the past hours. The corridor led to a junction. The junction led to a stairwell. The stairwell led down, through the wall of the dome, into the bedrock. We went through the hatch. We entered the corridor. We were 10 meters from the junction when the wall to our right exploded. Not outward, inward. Something hit the wall from the other side with enough force to shatter the prefabricated panels and send a spray of debris across the corridor. I went down. Malaya went down. Draven threw himself backward toward the hatch, and through the ruined wall, ducking to fit through a gap that would have been a doorway for anything human-sized, came a world eater. I saw it from the floor. Flat on my back, looking up, my vision full of dust and debris and the fluorescent light that was flickering and failing above me. It filled the corridor, not metaphorically, physically. Its shoulders brushed both walls, its head bare, nails trailing from the base of its skull like the tentacles of some deep ocean predator, nearly touched the ceiling. Its armor was not just red. It was wet, dripping. A constant slow rain of blood falling from its war plate onto the clean white floor of the maintenance corridor, pooling around its boots, spreading outward in a widening stain. The chain axe in its right hand was still spinning, still screaming, the teeth clogged with matter that I did not want to identify. In its left hand, hanging by the hair, it carried a head. A human head, eyes open, mouth open, the expression on its face frozen in the last moment of whatever emotion it had been feeling when the axe did its work. It dropped the head. It did not throw it. It simply released it, the way you would release an object that had ceased to be interesting, and the head hit the floor and rolled and came to rest against the wall near my feet, and I saw its face, and I recognized it. It was the man from the financial division, the one in the dark blue tunic who had refused to enter the ventilation shafts, the one who had said he would rather take his chances on the stairs. He had taken his chances, and the chances had been 0. The World Eater looked down at me, I should say, because I was on the floor and it was standing, and the distance between its eyes and mine was the distance between a man and an insect that he has found on his boot. And in that look, in that brief, fractional moment of eye contact, I understood something that all the manifests and all the documents and all the numbers in the archives of the Numistral spire could never have taught me. It did not see me, not the way one human being sees another, not the way a predator sees prey, not even the way a soldier sees an enemy. It saw me the way a fire sees fuel, not as a thing with a name and a history and a life and a purpose, but as raw material, combustible matter, something that existed solely to be consumed, to be fed into the furnace of its rage, to be converted from a living being into a dead one, and in doing so to provide a momentary reprieve from the agony of the nails. I was not an opponent. I was not a victim. I was not even a sacrifice. I was nothing. I was a chemical reaction waiting to happen, a calorie of violence that had not yet been expended, and the look in those eyes, those empty, weeping, ruined eyes, was the look of something that had long ago forgotten what a human being was, and could no longer distinguish between a census scribe and a drop of blood on the floor. The chain axe came up. I did not think. I did not plan. I did not weigh options or calculate probabilities or reach for the arithmetical habits of a lifetime. My body moved on its own, driven by something deeper and older and more fundamental than thought, the primal imperative of a thing that does not want to die. I rolled, sideways, to the left, away from the axe, and the teeth screamed past my head close enough to tear the collar of my tunic and send a spray of fabric fragments across my face. The axe hit the floor where my chest had been, and the teeth dug in, and for a fraction of a second, the warrior's arm was extended and its balance was committed, and I was already moving, scrambling on my hands and knees, through the dust and the blood and the debris toward the junction at the end of the corridor. Malaya was there. She had her hand out. I grabbed it and she pulled and I was on my feet, and we were running, both of us, down the stairwell, into the wall of the dome, into the dark. Behind us, the World Eater tore its axe free from the floor and followed, and the sound of it coming, the heavy rhythmic crash of ceramite on stone, was the sound of a countdown reaching 0. The stairwell was narrow, too narrow for the warrior to move at full speed, its armored bulk scraping the walls on both sides, gouging the stone, showering sparks. It slowed it down. Not much. A few seconds. Enough for us to reach the first landing, to turn the corner, to put a bend in the stairwell between us and the thing that was coming down behind us. Malaya was ahead of me. She was fast, faster than me, her thin frame an advantage in the narrow space, and she was pulling away, her feet hammering the stone steps, her breathing ragged and harsh. The stairwell curved, spiraling downward through the dome's wall, and the fluorescent lights were failing, some of them shattered by the vibration of the warrior's pursuit, others simply dead, leaving patches of absolute darkness between the pools of remaining light. I ran through light and dark and light again, and the footsteps behind me grew louder, closer, and the vibration in my chest was no longer a rhythm. It was a roar, a continuous, deafening, all-consuming wall of sensation that obliterated everything else, every thought, every feeling, every fragment of the man I had been that morning when I sat at my cogitator and opened the grain allotment files and did not know that the world was about to end. Malaya reached a door. She hit it with her shoulder and it burst open and we tumbled through into a tunnel, a real tunnel, carved from bedrock, rough-walled, low-ceilinged, lit by a string of chemical glow strips that cast everything in a pale green light. The Mechanicus service tunnel, the escape route, the way out. Malaya pulled the door shut behind us. It was heavy, industrial grade, a pressure-sealed bulkhead designed to maintain atmospheric integrity between the dome and the tunnel network. It locked with a deep, satisfying clunk, and for a moment, for perhaps 15 seconds, there was silence. Real silence. Not the muffled by distant silence of the 58th floor, but the silence of a sealed space, of thick stone walls and pressurized air and a door between us and everything that wanted us dead. I leaned against the tunnel wall and my legs were shaking and my lungs were burning and my heart was hammering against the inside of my ribs so hard that I could feel it in my fingertips. And Malaya was across from me, her back against the opposite wall, her chest heaving, her eyes closed, and she was smiling. Not a large smile, not a happy smile. A small, involuntary, purely physiological smile, the kind that happens when the body realizes it is still alive and the muscles of the face respond before the mind can overrule them. I felt it on my own face, that same treacherous flicker of relief, that same absurd, irrational ember of hope that said, "We made it. We are in the tunnel. The door is closed. We are going to survive this." The hope lasted until I looked down the tunnel and saw Drevhan. He was 30 meters ahead of us, lying on his side against the tunnel wall, his orange coveralls stained dark from the waist down, his tool belt still buckled, the flat-headed pry that had opened a dozen access panels still gripped in his right hand. He had made it back through the hatch. He had found another way down. He had reached the tunnel before us, and something had reached the tunnel before him. The wound was in his back, a single massive impact that had caved in his spine and the ribs on either side, the kind of damage that only something with transhuman strength could inflict with a single blow. His face was turned toward us, and the expression on it was not fear or pain, but concentration. The focused, professional expression of a man who had been working a problem when the problem killed him. He had been heading toward us. He had been coming to find us. I walked to him. I knelt beside him. I closed his eyes because it seemed like the thing to do, because the protocols of basic human decency had survived inside me even when everything else was failing. He was still warm. The tunnel air was cold, but his body still held its heat, and the warmth of him against my fingers was the worst thing I had felt all day. Worse than the vibration. Worse than the broken glass, worse than the copper taste in my mouth, because warmth meant recent, and recent meant close, and close meant the thing that had killed him might still be here. I stood up. I looked down the tunnel, past Drevhan's body, into the green-lit dark that stretched away toward whatever lay at the other end. And that is when the thing that had kept me alive all day, the thing that was not courage or instinct or faith, but simple, cold, arithmetical habit, fired one last time. I saw the markings on the tunnel wall. Directional codes painted in the Angular Mechanicus maintenance script that I had processed on 1,000 requisition forms, junction designators, section numbers, flow routing data. My eyes found them automatically, and my brain processed them automatically. And what the numbers told me was this: Section 7-Gamma-12, southbound. I knew this designation. 2 years ago, I had processed the infrastructure audit for the Subdome Service Network, a routine assessment of maintenance tunnel capacity and structural integrity that had crossed my desk as part of the quarterly review cycle. Dull work. The kind that made your eyes glaze and your attention wander. But I had done it thoroughly, precisely, with complete attention to every detail, and the detail that surfaced now from the filing cabinet of my memory was this. Section 7-Gamma-12 had a branch junction approximately 200 meters south, a secondary tunnel that led to the atmospheric processor cooling system for Dome 3. It was not an exit, it was not an escape, but it was a divergence, a fork in the path, and forks meant choices, and choices meant that whoever was behind us would have to choose too, and if they chose wrong, we might live for another 5 minutes. I grabbed Malaya's arm. I said, "South, 200 meters, branch junction." She did not ask how I knew. She did not question the source. She simply turned and ran, and I ran with her, past Drevhan's body, past the flat-headed pry in his dead hand, past the last of the people who had helped us, and the last of the warmth that the living leave behind. We had covered perhaps 100 meters when the door behind us, the heavy pressure-sealed bulkhead that Malaya had locked with such finality, tore off its hinges and flew across the tunnel and shattered against the far wall. And the World Eater came through. It was faster here. The tunnel was wider than the stairwell, and the warrior moved through it with the terrible, lurching speed that I had seen in the plaza. That headlong, graceless charge that ate distance like a fire eats air. I could hear it breathing behind me, the wet, mechanical rasp of lungs that were more machine than organic. And I could feel the heat of it, the literal physical heat that radiated from its armor and its body, a furnace warmth that pushed against my back like a hand. Malaya turned to look back at me. She was still running, but she had turned her head and our eyes met, and I saw in her face a thing that I had not seen there before. Not fear, not resignation, something else, something that looked impossibly like peace. As if in the act of running toward death with nothing left to lose and no illusion left to shatter, she had found something that she had been looking for without knowing it. A clarity, a final, absolute honesty about the nature of the universe and her place in it. She was going to die. She knew it. And the knowing had set her free. She was still looking at me when the axe took her. One stride, one swing, one sound that was not a sound but an ending. And she was gone. The woman who had sat next to me for 8 years, who had argued with me about recaf rituals and data entry protocols, who had pulled me away from the window when the world ended, who had read the manifests and understood the truth and kept moving anyway. She was gone, and the pulse behind my sternum did not even flicker. It pounded on, steady, relentless, indifferent, the heartbeat of a god that did not know her name and would not have cared if it did. I stopped running, not because I gave up, not because I accepted death, not because there was anything noble or dignified about the decision. I stopped because my legs stopped, because the animal that had been driving my body for the last 5 hours finally ran out of fuel, and the muscles that had carried me upstairs and through shafts and along walkways and down spiraling tunnels simply refused to take another step. I stood in the green light of the service tunnel with Malaya's blood on my tunic and the World Eater 3 meters behind me. Somewhere ahead, perhaps 100 meters, perhaps less, was the branch junction. Section 7, Gamma 12. The fork that might have given me 5 more minutes. But my legs would not carry me there, and the numbers that had served me all day had finally run out of distance. I thought about the grain allotment for Dome 17, the discrepancy that had started my morning, the figure I had corrected so neatly at my desk a lifetime ago. 7,412 changed to 4,712. A simple transposition, a minor error, the kind that happened every day. It was not an error, it never was. The chain axe sound fills the tunnel. It fills my ears, my chest, my skull. The vibration and the sound merge into a single frequency, a note so pure and so absolute that it becomes silence, or something beyond silence, something that exists on the other side of hearing. I feel the heat of the thing behind me, close now, so close that I can smell it. Copper and iron, and the sour, sweet stink of meat left in the sun. And I think about my desk on the 42nd floor, and my cogitator terminal, and my stylus, and my neat columns of numbers. And I think about how a man can spend his entire life maintaining a system that is designed to consume him, filing his own death certificate in triplicate without ever knowing that is what he is doing. I turn around. I do not know why. Some final, stupid, defiant impulse from the thing inside me that once called itself Torven Gael, census scribe of the 3rd Administrative Bureau, the man who found the error. I want to see it. I want to see the thing that is going to end me, the way I have always looked at things, with clarity, with precision, with the cold and patient eye of a man whose only gift was the ability to describe exactly what was in front of him. It is right there, filling the tunnel, its armor scraping the walls, its chain axe held low, still spinning, the teeth throwing a fine mist of what used to be Malaya into the green-lit air between us. Its face is a mask of fury and damage and 10,000 years of uninterrupted war, and the cables of the butcher's nails twitch and pulse at the base of its skull, and the eyes, those awful, weeping, empty eyes, look through me as if I am not there, as if I have never been there, as if nothing has ever been there except blood and bone and the raw material of slaughter. It does not roar. It does not scream. It does not make any sound at all except the wet, rhythmic breathing and the mechanical whine of the chain axe. It simply steps forward. One step. The distance between us closes to nothing. I can see the individual teeth of the axe. I can see the scoring on its armor. 10 millennia of scratches and dents and repair welds layered one atop another, like the rings of a tree that grew in hell. I can see the skulls on its belt, small ones and large ones, human and xenos, and things that I cannot identify. Each one a record, a receipt, a ledger entry in a book of the dead that stretches back further than the history of my world. And then it speaks. Not a sentence, not a war cry, not a declaration or a threat or anything that carries the weight of intent or meaning. A single word forced out through clenched teeth, through a throat that has been screaming for 10,000 years, through a mouth that has forgotten the shape of language and remembers only the shape of rage. The word comes out broken, barely recognizable, half drowned by the mechanical grinding of the nails and the wet rasp of ruined lungs. But I hear it. In the green light of the service tunnel, with the chain axe spinning between us and my sister's name still burning in the back of my skull, I hear the word, and it is more. Just that. More. Spoken the way a dying man speaks the word water, or a starving man speaks the word bread. Not a command, not a desire, a need. A biological imperative carved into the meat of its brain by the nails, the single remaining thought in a mind that once belonged to a warrior of the Legionese, a Star Tess, that once held strategy and brotherhood and perhaps even something that resembled honor, and now holds nothing except a hunger that can never be satisfied and a word that describes it. More blood, more death, more fuel for the furnace, more relief, however brief, from the agony that is every waking second of its existence. I look into those weeping eyes, and I hear that word, and I understand, for the first and last time, what the butcher's nails have done. They have not made a monster. They have made a beggar, a thing on its knees before its own pain, pleading for the only currency that buys a moment's peace. And I am that currency, and Malaya was that currency, and every soul in every dome on Vithara Secundus is that currency. Not enemies, not sacrifices. Coins. Coins dropped into a slot that never fills. I open my mouth, not to scream, not to beg. I do not know what I was going to say. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps a number. The last number. 8,000, the first entry on the manifest, the opening line of the compact, the price of blood that started everything. Or perhaps my own name, Torven Gael. A sound, a shape, a collection of syllables that meant absolutely nothing to the thing standing in front of me, but that meant everything to me because it was the only thing I had ever truly owned in a galaxy that owned everything else. But that is not what comes. What comes, unbidden, automatic, rising from the deepest part of the man I was, and the only part that still functions, is a number. My number. The one I have been keeping all day, the running tally, the count of the dead that I have witnessed and failed to save, and walked past and crawled over and left behind in dark shafts in burning plazas. I add Malaya, I add the enforcers, I add the children at the skolum and the crowd at the airlock, and the people in the duct who knocked and called and were not answered. I add Prothus, because I know. I add the man from the financial division whose head rolled to my feet. I added Doreen, who was taken 7 years ago and fed to a machine that I spent my life maintaining. I add them all. And then, at the very end of the column, at the bottom of the ledger, in the last line of the last page of the last register that will ever matter, I add myself. Entry 14,621, Torven Gael, Census Scribe, 3rd Administrative Bureau, Dome 1, Vithara Secundus. Status, processed. The numbers balance at last. I open my mouth and the axe